So what I have prepared for this 40-minute lecture, and hopefully I can stay within the time scheduled, is a presentation of the chapter that I published in the edited volume published by Chris Shea earlier this year, entitled Taiwan Manipulation of Ideology and Struggle for Identity. And the chapter was called A Sociolinguistic Approach to the Standardization of Taiyu in the Quest for a Taiwanese Identity. I actually have remained true to the content of the chapter, but during the discussion we can elaborate a little bit more. Yeah, the book, by the way, the edited volume is online accessible via Google Scholar in its entirety, so not the pieces here and there. Okay, Julie, next slide. Shaiga. Yeah. The main focus that I want to bring across today is putting into perspective the four-step matrix model, which was developed by the Norwegian sociologist Einar Haugen, and in which he explains the role of writing, so script and literacy practices in the growth of nationalism. And he applies this in a framework that looks at the transition from dialect and vernacular to a standard. And there, of course, we come to the notion of standardization. And because that is tied to nationalism, it is not free from ideology. And in that perspective, yes, we can say Taiwan does present an interesting case as a multilingual and multicultural nation state where language is a politically and ideologically dividing factor in society. So the focus of the talk will be on the processes that are involved in the standardization of Southern Min. Okay, a couple of words on the terminology. We have Southern Min, which translates in Mandarin as Minayu, and other words, other terms for Southern Min are Taiyu, the equivalent of Taigi in Southern Min, also known as Taiwan Hokkien, Fulaohua, and Holo, or the more common parlance we use Taiwanese, as people also say Mandarin and Hakka. This is one of the elements whenever we write about Taiwan and we touch on the language, we more or less have to explain which terminology and romanization system we are going to use. And this is the romanization system will also come in further down in this presentation to the attention. Yeah, next slide, where we have the wide range of terminology. Yeah. So the quest for this linguistic standard or calls for language equality on a national level in this Taiwan multicultural and multilingual society, of course, also involves other languages than those spoken of the Sinosphere, namely the Austronesian language, the for Austronesian Formosan languages known as the indigenous languages to the island, as well as the foreign imported languages, and then we refer to English, Japanese, and more recently the languages of the Southeast Asian nations, Vietnamese, Bahasa, Indonesian, Malay, Tagalog. But the approach I take today is on Taiyu and explained within the matrix model, as I've come to repeat myself, developed by Haugen, and with the intention to shed light on how the dynamics are between the linguistic and the social meaning making of language in society, and how and why certain languages struggle more than others in achieving this language equality, this prestige in relation to others. The model that I will focus on is organized on the level of the form and the function of a language, and are presented as the selection of the norm, the codification, of the form, the elaboration of the function, and the acceptance by the community. And that's a matrix model. So all have to link with one another and have to be in resonance too. Next, I added a couple of references by Haugen's work, since this actually all draws back to the 60s. Then he improved some of his 4 steps in the mid 70s, later 70s, and so on. The next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the a graph of the matrix form, where the selection of the norm as well as the acceptance is on the level of society, and codification and elaboration is on the level of the language, whereas codification refers to the form and elaboration of the function of the language within society. And it's those 4 concepts actually that I will elaborate on in this presentation, giving examples where are the difficulties, the challenges, and the opportunities, and what makes the quest for a linguistic standard of Taiwanese today still at moment problematic. Yeah, next one. Okay. I cited a quote here from a work by Hannes Dottir, who is Anna, on the application of Haugen's model in the development of the Swedish language. Just to give an idea that it has been applied and implemented in other cases where language proves to be at times problematic within the wider discussion of society. So what does she say? Haugen's model is appropriate for assessing the different diachronic processes constituting the transition of a language from a domestic vernacular, which is a keyword here, which is still not properly codified, to the next keyword, the standard national language, and that's the standardization process suitable for use in all domains of modern society. And all domains refers or pertains to the function of the elaboration and the implementation of the language. And of course, this is all part of what we call language planning and language policy. Next one, yeah. Okay. Within the keywords of the previous slide, the domestic vernacular not being properly codified, we now come to the next step, and that brings us actually closer to understanding Taiwan, the definition of some of the terms that still cause confusion, and explain the underpinnings in the language problem. It's the discussion or the differences or the usage, and then the perception and the meaning attached to it of language, dialect, and vernacular. Now, if we keep in mind that the matrix model is to show how the underpinnings are rooted in the development of writing and the growth of nationalism, we of course come to the framework of nation building. And within that context, the ideology of standardization makes sense, and relating this to Taiwan today. Yes, where is the ideology in the standardization? One expression is the politically driven reverse language shift, or some researchers also refer to the Taigi revitalization movement. So what can we do in order to make society speak Taiwanese in relation to Mandarin, which is the dominant language? The ideology is also associated with those in favor of speaking Taiwanese, are not in favor of the identification of Taiwan as a province of the Republic of China. And then we have to come to the cross-strait issue and the One China policy. So yes, there is a lot of politics and ideology involved in perceived and not necessarily properly perceived. So sometimes stories get made up and they start leading their own lives. And we also feel this occasionally being the case with the perception of Taiwanese within society. But we'll come to this later. Next slide, please. Yeah. So how can we apply this model to the language situation and the language planning policies in Taiwan in particular? And then we have to go back to the context of nation building, which actually goes earlier. And we return to the beginning of the 20th century and say a few more words on models of language development regarding the Chinese language, but at the same time also in Meiji Japan, where we see the establishment of, not the establishment, the transition from a literary non-spoken language, classical Chinese, one yin one, to the spoken vernacular. And one of the keywords, the concept there is the Yenwen Ichi, or in Japanese, the Genbun Ichi, and the unification of the spoken and the written word. If we want to have I mean, it's within the context of modernization, of literacy campaigns. If we want provide general education as well, we need to have a language that the language that we speak to be able to write this down and not being tied down by a classical language, which is actually not spoken and is then being within the context of the establishment of the Republic of China in 1911, as well as the reforms in Meiji Japan, is the classical language is then being associated with a more feudal, conservative, outdated society that we no longer have the need for. And here too, when we, the terminology we use in Chinese is Baihua Wen. So that is already a vernacularization where we see this term appearing. Now, at the time, beginning of the 20th century, Taiwan was a Japanese colony, which meant that education slowly was being taken over in the Japanese language. From the 1920s and the 1930s, we also see a number of intellectuals fluent in Japanese, but actually concerned with bringing this concept of the Yenwen Ichi and the unification of the spoken and the written word, and applying this to the language that everyone spoke in society. And then we can't refer really to Mandarin, because that was taking place, the modernization was taking place in Republican China on the mainland, but they wanted to apply this to the language that people spoke within Taiwan, and then there comes in the term Taiwanese. So we have the Taiwan Hua Wen movement, meaning we are going to write down with characters the way we speak our home language in order to assist with the literacy campaigns and the education that we have in Japanese. Now, at the same time, there is also the Mandarin Baihua Wen moving in. There is a Romanization movement, but important for the presentation here is that a start was made, that data was being collected, that there were discussions how to create characters, how to select the characters, and how this was then ideologically tied to the promotion of the local colors. Now, in spite of the regime change, because the colonial period lasted for 50 years, 1895 till 1945, these experiments with the creation of a written Taiwanese, and that is one of the terms that we use in the scholarship too, was published in local poetry journals or a couple of intellectual journals. But come the mid-30s, 1936-37, when we have the Huangmihua, the Kominka, the Japanization of Taiwanese society, Chinese language materials, and the use of where was still Chinese being used, whether this was Mandarin, Taiyu, Hakka, was kind of curtailed. In spite of the regime change, in 1945, Taiwan changes from its Japanese colony back to a Chinese province with the retrocession in the ROC, and the imposition of a new language. And that new language, of course, then is the Mandarin brought in with the Kuoming, the nationalist government setting up the school system and implementing the language hegemony, where the purpose was everyone from now on speaks Mandarin in order the ROC nation building, and also to keep sufficient social control of the society. In spite of this introduction of the new language hegemony, the colonial efforts that were done by these language pioneers and these language lovers in the 20s and the 30s generated enough evidence and interest actually not to disappear. And that's where we then can continue with the interest there is, and the movement, the 60s, 70s movement on the Taiwanese language. Next one, please. Okay, yeah. Now, where is the problem on, or the issue that we have with this Taiwanese versus Mandarin? It's, as we see here on the right-hand side, it's often compounded by the uses of language and dialect, and they are mixed up between the structural, which is the linguistic description of dialect, and the functional or the social use and its dimensions of both terms, which readily defines actually Taiyu is still a dialect in relation to Mandarin as the national language, based on the perception that it lacks a written form. And precisely the role, that's where I bring in the Haugen element, because the importance of the writing in the development of this nationalism, and the script by which you express yourself in the language becomes important. Yeah, so there is the notion Taiyu as a dialect versus Mandarin as a language, but we cannot say that Taiyu is a dialect of the standard Mandarin, and that's the mistake that is often made and started to lead its own life and is being used for all kinds of political reasons. So where every dialect is a language, but not every language is a dialect too. Now, the process that marks the transition, which I will then illustrate in the 4 steps from this vernacular, this undeveloped, this not complete, entirely codified language within the Chinese parlance, we use the Fangyan and the regional language, to a standard national language, is characterized by this uniformity of the spoken and the written, as we have seen in the 1910s with Mandarin. The same took place at the Genbun Ichi in Japan. And we have exactly the same process which is taking place for Taiwanese. But we have a couple of complicating factors and dynamics that come into play. And now we move to the next slide. Truly, Shaika. Yeah. The next slide, please. Yeah. So where the linguistic term dialect has been mistakenly used to denote the social subordinate relation to the standard. And the language in its vernacular stage, the fact that we speak Taiwanese but we don't necessarily write it down, was justified as a continuum for the functional superiority of Mandarin over the inferiority of the Taiyu, again, mainly based on that perception that it was not written. And it's the stereotype perception that illustrates Haugen's observation on the development of writing, orthography as a crucial aspect in understanding the ideology of language standardization in the nation building framework. Why do I come back to the nation building framework? Because this is what we see, the identification with Taiwan in the post-war years, and especially following the democratization of society, the lifting of martial law, which kind of accelerated a number of aspects. Yeah, next one. So how can we how can we picture this matrix model within which we are going to look at the transition from a vernacular, so a spoken language on a dialectal status, to in its quest to become a language, a standard on the national level. And we can actually all think back to our own languages here. First, we need to select one form from the written and the spoken dialectal variations, which is going to be the norm. And this norm will be then developed in the linguistic standard. The norm needs to be codified, so that means we need to have dictionaries, we need to have grammar rules, we need to have a vocabulary, a lexicon, and a syntax. So why is this necessary? In order to use the language in all the domains of society. So in education, in professional life, not only at home and with the family, but in all domains of society. Yeah. And this then, this use in all domains corresponds to the step called elaboration. And the final result is that the language, of course, which has now increased to the level of a standard, has to be accepted within the community as the new linguistic standard. And it's often the acceptance that we see in the case of Taiwanese, which plays a big role still. So what is the main stigma? There are no, there is no written form. And there I have to repeat myself again, because sometimes that helps. The development of writing is a crucial aspect for understanding the ideology that underlies language standardization in a nation building framework. Now, for this presentation, as well for the chapter in the edited volume, I focused on the written language, on the orthography, not so much the spoken language in explaining the matrix form. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the debates on orthography. Writing and script is not a neutral technology. They have a symbolic power that transcends language itself, and they also become symbolic then of group identity. I refer to the work by Brian Street, the literacy in theory and practice, and as a good example, which kind of was quite helpful in further illustrating the work by Mark Seba. Yeah. So the nation building then that we have to bring in the content with Taiwan from the 70s, 80s, and the ascendance of this Taiwanese identity and democratization had in its way that it challenged the political hierarchy. As a result, we had also the lifting of martial law, and the democratic transition enabled that it became possible to challenge this national hierarchy with a policy making of multi. We are a multicultural society, a multilingual society, which then generated possibilities in the long march, and it's very long march for language equality, where the purpose is raising the status and promoting the language to the national level. Now, how is that being played out using the with the Taiwanese language, so with Taiyu within the matrix format? And I think now, next slide, we come to the 4 steps. First of all, let's look at selection of the norm for Taiyu. Which writing systems do we have? We have to go back to the colonial period, but we even have to go earlier, because the language lovers, the language makers from the 20s and the 30s, the intellectuals, are very much concerned with we have to elevate our Taiwan culture. They actually went back to the regional literature that was written in Southern Min. So one of the, which at one point was one of the emerging guanghua, so I have the literary standard on the one hand, which is which were like folk plays and folk plays and stories, and a second writing script, and there comes all the complexities in, was that since the late 1880s, I'm sure going back to the 1830s, there was a Romanized, a complete Romanized system for Taiwanese, which was developed by the missionaries and the Protestant clergy since the beginning centuries of the 19th centuries, who were based in the Nanyang region, and then slowly coming over to Taiwan when Taiwan opened up in the mid-1860s thanks to the opening of the treaty ports. We have these a couple of missionaries who compile dictionaries, and they use the Romanization system, so an alphabetic writing for Taiwanese, for their proselytation, for doing the masses and translating the Bible. Translating the Bible, all the scriptures, and in addition also a number of medical works. And they set up a newspaper. A newspaper means like the gazetteer, the church, the Tainan church paper. So we have actually two scripts. We have a character script and we have an alphabetic writing, and they both developed their own traditions. They had their own repositories and registers on which they could fall back. And during the Japanese colonial periods, actually both scripts were enabled the composition of written literature, because as much as the couple of intellectuals and writers who were interested in turning the spoken Taiwanese into a written Taiwanese, they had to fall back on either the dictionaries of the missionaries that were compiled in characters with Romanization. There was also the late 1929, 2030 Japanese major dictionaries, or these writings from late 16th, 17th century onwards, as well as there was a promotion with a number of Christians to actually promote and implement the Romanization system itself. Of course, come in the post-war years, when Mandarin becomes a national language, and all the local languages are reduced to Fangyan, so better don't speak it in public. It it also had some implications for the orthographies, for the character script, and the romanization. And that's where we come to now, influencing the selection of the norm. Next one. Yeah, here I have a number of examples. This is the middle one is an extract from the church paper from the late 19th century, set up in 1885, which continued, and I think is continued throughout colonial period in the later years too, but then you have to stop at one particular time because of political reasons. To the left, yeah, that's one of the dictionaries, which has no characters. It's entirely in romanization. And then the four green volumes to the left are works by Usho Lee, who actually he was born in 1920, and he is one of the icons, as we can say, of collecting and doing research on the Chinese dialects, in particular the Minnan and Southern Min, but also works on Hakka. So these are works that refer to the character script repository, where we now move on to the next slide. Yeah. So examples of the character script. It's a repetition of what I just have come to say. Usho Lee, a number of other people involved. Lien Hung also wrote in also as a Taiyu dictionary from the colonial period, and then the names Xu Zhengqiang, Ang Weijing, and Ya Rongsong are the post-war generation who continued doing research in Taiwanese linguistics, and as much Minnan as Hakka. On the romanization or the Peiweiqi, we may say that was sufficiently codified, since there was a Taiwan church newspaper that came out on a weekly, monthly basis. And when we look at today, the role the romanization also played was it created mainly then the church, the Presbyterian church. It was a supporters base for the oppositional politics. And the first generation of the mother tongue teachers, because now we also speak of mother tongue, but that in the meantime has also already changed into the local language teachers. But the first generation of the mother tongue teachers were actually those who came through the ranks and were affiliated with the Presbyterian Church, and this is because of the oppositional politics to KMT rule. So you can say the Taiyu revitalization movement has its origins in this generation of mother tongue teachers who became very concerned with their language. And why is there the link with the church? Because the church needed these people once from the 70s and then the 80s, when it became, and definitely into the 90s, when the bans were kind of lifted on speaking Taiwanese, to have these people to draw back on them to for not only the church work, but also continuing the written literature in romanization. And since there was a basis of oppositional politics, it's their support for the language tying to pressure groups for reforming other political aspects and societal aspects. That link is fairly easy to make. Yeah. Next. So come the 1990s, and so then we see an orthographic diversification that increasingly links language to identity politics. And apart from the support of the Presbyterian Church, as I've just come to mention, who are active in the establishment of a Taiwanese language movement, there is also an interest or push from number of linguists, writers, intellectuals, cultural activists who were living in exile, whether it was United States, but mainly United States and Japan, and who link up with whether or not with supporters within the Christian church. So that church element and the link to Taiwanese is definitely not to be ignored. Their purpose, they want to preserve the language, and at the same time it's also an expression of resistance against the party in control and the speak-only Mandarin movement. Now, late 80s and 90s, their outreach was still fairly limited, and this starts to change when we then have the democratization of Taiwan in the year 2000, where it becomes more openly, and finally we have then the green politics, so to speak, in power, and the push forward to bring in more pressure for increasing for the language equality on the level of Taiwanese with Mandarin. Next slide. Yeah, these are some examples. From the Bong magazine, it's one of was established in the early 90s, I think the mid 90s, was one of the first call it newsletters which used written Taiwanese, and actually a mixture, to which I come to speak, of characters and romanization. The one next to it is one of the Taiwanese textbook series. Then the Taigi is currently a journal that publishes in English, in Mandarin, and in Taigi, and in romanization and in characters on topics related to Taiwanese, to Taigi. And then below we have the mid-level is a poetry series. Then the one to the right, it's the translation in Taiwanese of Wang Yude's Taiwan Kum in the Leisure, the sad history of Taiwan. It's one of the works written by Wang Yude when he had to leave Taiwan in the late 40s, going to exile to Japan, and continued his language efforts and promotion for Taiwanese, and his further other writings. Then the one to the left is one of the I think it's one of the conference proceedings on academic conference that we have, talking about Taiwanese literature, Taiwanese language, and so on. So yes, there is a whole variety of materials available to actually work on and learn and verse yourself in Taiwanese. Next slide. Yeah. The complexity, because we are actually at this moment still with the selection of the norm, is that a complexity that comes in is that we select this norm, but we have three competing factions. There are those who are in favor of full character script. So we're going to write our Taiwanese, and the norm we choose only characters. Then there is a group that says, no, we stick to the Romanization, and this was the Romanization system, the PWG used by the Presbyterian Church. And then there is a group who says, no, I mean, for some words, some terms, we can't find characters, or we can't agree basically on which characters to use. Drawing from the old dictionary, the 19th century dictionaries, or the writings before. So why don't we actually mix both? And where we are not sure, we just use the alphabetic writing, we just use the PWG. This becomes even more complex since 2006, when there is kind of there is not a breakaway from the church Romanization, but some of the linguists involved within the same group finds it politically more acceptable to work with a slightly different, to introduce a slightly different adapted list of alphabetic representation transcription, which we then call the Thai law. And this one is recognized by the Ministry of Education, which was a big step forward, coming from a situation where we all have to speak Mandarin, and when you speak Taiwanese, this is kind of not acceptable, really. But the Ministry of Education uses it as a guideline. It's advised, but it's not mandatory, with the result that until today, we still have the coexistence of several systems. So some continue using the church Romanization, other than switched to Thai law. And then on top of this, there is then a group saying, no, as much characters as possible, the full character script, or the mixture of both. Yeah. Now, when concluding this section on the selection of the norm, which is fairly elaborate, is that there is a fairly successful process towards the standardization of the orthography in the character script. Yes, there is the alphabetic writing, and then a high degree of consensus on the hand law. And by hand law, we mean the mixture of both. Hand for characters and law for lawmaatse, for romanization. So I'm not venturing at this moment in the number of intellectuals, amateurs who came up with, we invented yet another written script for Taiwanese. So these are not really in the discussion. Because they are on basically the minor side. Yeah. So selection of the norm, yes, on the basis of orthography, we have the choice out of 3. And of these 3, then we still have 2 different alphabetic systems by which we can write the not write the characters, but the alphabetic representation of Taiyu. Come to codification, the next step. So on society, we decided, yes, this is the norm. These are the orthographies we can use. Now we have to codify, and we have to codify, then is the language, and we have to codify the grammar and the lexicon. I divided this slide into 3 parts. Some people play a bigger role than others, and a fairly important role in helping with the codification, towards working towards dictionaries, bringing people from the literary circle together, meeting on a regular basis, writing, like poetry clubs, writing short stories in the language. All this helps in practicing, but there is a difference. The purpose for them is to practice the language, not really to modernize the language. And that's the next step to which we come. On the education level, big impetus has come also from the mother tongue teachers and the cultural activists, who at one particular moment, and that's one of the next slides, there is this disagreement between the spelling, and it are actually the mother tongue teachers who say, like, look, by all honesty, we will follow the Taiwan system that the Ministry of Education has favored, and with result that a number of, let's say, the first 300 characters are officially also accepted by the Ministry of Education, put in a dictionary which is online available. So it's the working together of the educational structure, the Ministry of Education, with the government to a limited extent to allow for the Taiwanese standardization of characters and orthography on the Romanized side, the alphabetic Romanized. Now, one element, one aspect, yeah, this is an example of the mixture, as we can see, with characters and Romanization, yeah. And it's within this Romanization that we have the Romanization used by the Presbyterian Church, which is still an example of this writing. And then there is the Taiwan, the one from since 2006, which has been accepted by the Ministry of Education, but we have the choice to use the one or the other, as since there is still this non-uniformity. On the codification, I have to mention the input of the linguist Robert Chung, who actually developed a database which could input a number of, we call it the Taiyu Data Lab, of which the automation actually allowed it to put in a large number of characters, and at the same time also have this converted into Romanization system. So that actually made it easier to come to a selection or a discussion or a decision if one was deciding on or choosing which characters to choose within writing my novel. Now, the difference here was that his idea was like language modernization rather than and planning rather than language preservation, where the latter more or less means what is the most authentic word, authentic character we can use for this particular meaning. So either you move along and then you automate, yes, you or you try to work with the traditional Chinese phonology system. And it was actually the two groups within those pro-automatization and modernization. And yes, we use the Western language theories in order to push our language rather than the versus the group who was more in favor of the traditional Chinese phonology way of creating characters and the 6 principles. Next slide. Yeah, so I mentioned before there was this kind of Romanization spelling war within the totality of the Taiyu language discourse. And then we can ask, okay, you are all one group, you are pushing for this language, how come you kind of end up in fighting with one another and causing cleavages within your own group? It's kind of as I just said, the difference between introducing a novel model of language planning that didn't very well go, with a traditional Chinese phonology in searching for appropriate characters. Technical innovation goes faster, but one also needs to have the mentality and accept this. However, when the mother tongue teachers, when they adopted the spelling, which was favored by the Ministry of Education, they kind of enlisted, they kind of this facilitated enlisting the mother tongue classes into the national educational system, because they were not going to more or less take sides. Yeah. So, and then using these, the Thai law integrated spelling classes became a central component of the Thai language curriculum. So we can speak it, we speak the language, but yeah, we also need to know how to write it, whether we use alphabetic writing or we use characters. And so in one crucial element when the teaching of Taiwanese started at university level 2 is learning how to correctly spell and transcribe the pronunciation of the characters using the romanization system. As we know, in Taiwan for Mandarin we use Popomorpho, but the Popomorpho was not particularly applicable also for ideological reasons to Taiwanese. Next slide. Yeah. So this I think is the final section that we have on the codification. We have a linguistic variety, either full character script, romanization, or the mixture of both, using then two different transcriptions. They were, I mean, all these different ideas and these different programs, they were not, so their promoters, their advocates, they were not in competition with each other for the greater cause of, yes, we want this Taiwanese language revival, but if there was disagreement among one another, it had to do with the extent to which their activities, their personal, individual network, their activism could actually negatively impact the process of moving together forward as a group. And it's there where the mother tongue teachers say, okay, let's go with the transcription system that the Ministry of Education favors, rather than sticking to the church romanization one, in spite of the fact that we are Christians and we have these close connections with the Presbyterian Church. So it's for the cause, it's like, yeah, let's kind of accept and go with Ministry of Education. At least we will be one step up on the ladder, pushing for language equality in the long run with Taiwanese. So the push for the language equality has to operate within a framework, not to upset the dominant discourse too much. When there is also a reality at play, which is an issue with the codification too. It's easier to reach an audience that is literate in Chinese, in Mandarin, than one in romanization. If you want to organize conferences and so on. So yes, we have conferences about Taiwanese where everything is, where a number of the papers and the presentations are presented and written in Taiwanese, one of the three systems. Other papers in English too, but we have to keep in mind that still the foreign stigma of the language still lingers on in society, and that then comes to the element of acceptance. Yeah. Another issue current in codification is that in general most of the speakers are bilingual. In either one, are fully bilingual in either one of both languages, and if we have to further look into the codification towards the broadcasting system. That is currently the next, that is currently actually the challenge we have in the phonetic codification of the language, not the written one so much, with which I'm concerned at this point. The next slide. Yeah, elaboration. So we have the norm, we have these three scripts, we have codification to a certain extent, where we are still working on the dictionaries, on increasing and getting the Ministry of Education accepted more vocabulary on an annual basis. Now elaboration. In order to be successful, yes, the language which we want to level up to the national standard needs to be spread as wide as possible in society. So we have writers, we have novelists, they create literary works, they are active in reaching a broader public, whether this is general academic, but another element which is very important in the elaboration of the language is the organization is the professionalization and the language testing, so that we can implement this codified format and seeing to the production of a scientific academic literature. So actually starting to teach academic subjects in Taiwanese. It's one of the aims we currently have at the department. I'm at NTNU. So that's the definition of what is meant by the elaboration. So we have to put into practice the norm and the codified language in a wide variety within society as possible. So not only speaking it at home, but actually going to the bank and having vocabulary that is professionally used. Next slide, as I have to keep my time. Yeah. So the standard has to be used as widely maximum variation in society, yes. Whereas when we talk to codification, it's actually a minimum amount of variation. And what we mean that when we have a dictionary, when we have one word, then we have 17 different pronunciations and meanings, you know, that's rather complex. But with the standard for the elaboration has to be used as wide as possible in every single domain. Go to the bank, in the hospital, and here spread it out in education, academic conferences, create textbooks, set up testing systems. So the professionalization of the vocabulary, and that is currently one of the small obstacles, the obstacles that there is, because in reality, a number of the younger people are not particularly versed, are not really speaking Taiwanese, or they speak Taiwanese with the grandparents, and then they have limited vocabulary, and there is a disparity really in the competence and the acquisition of this professional vocabulary, like in medicine, flora, fauna. That's the reality, and of course that creates obstacles. Additional obstacles is the very slow legislation, and that's very much politics in hand, and engaging with the dominant Mandarin policy for sure. And then at times also the lack of consensus on the language shift among the parties involved. And then we come to the final step, that is the acceptance in society. Next slide, yeah, acceptance by the community. One of the issues that is still plaguing and the activists for Taiwanese, some are struggling with it, the perception in society that local variant is still locked in a dialectical substandard setting. Taiwanese is of lesser value, and the linguistic subordination is also socially felt. Yeah, there are a number of ideological standpoints, controversies that showed up among the group of the language promoters. are we going to distinguish between mother tongue writing and mother tongue literature? So is language written in Taiwanese only classified as mother tongue writing or mother tongue literature? What about the works talking about who have the topic of Taiwan society, culture, literature, and but written in Mandarin? So there is controversy there. Taiwan literature versus Sino-Taiwan literature, and then the term Sinophone literature. Furthermore, the use of Taiyu Taigi versus Minayu, where Minayu there is still a link as the dialect and used in the mainland, and that was one of the elements that came up when we have political change, that Taiyu then all at once becomes Minayu. Now, what I suggested, what I've been working on, is actually the notion to put forward a pluricentric framework, and rather than looking at language versus dialect. So I speak a language and you speak a dialect only because there is still the perception it's not written. Why don't we start looking at language versus a variant? There is a language, but it has several variants. And there the meaning of pluri is a unique language. Let's say we take Taiwanese, we take Southern Min as the monocentric language, which then functions at the same time in more than one distinct nation or statehood center. So there is a Southern Min then spoken in Taiwan, it's spoken in the mainland, in the southern provinces. It's also spoken in Malaysia and the Philippines. And each one has its distinct norms. So in Taiwan, we can say we speak Taiyu. The mainland, it will be Minayu. Malaysia, Southeast Asia, it's called Hokkien. And in Philippines, we speak of, we refer to the term Lanaway. So, but this two, next slide, and this two has, is easier said than done, because to start thinking in language versus dialect, in language versus we have all these different variants, and another term is also the topolex we can use. It requires a change of perception and language attitudes to actually overcome, and that's where the main obstacle is actually the deeply rooted monocultural and monolingual models that are currently still tied in with identity. And it's nothing new, because it has been imposed on Taiwanese society since 1945, and even before it was historically rooted in Chinese political economy. And the transition from classical Chinese, the Baihuawan, into one national language, the equally imposed under Japanese colonial rule, and on top the extra layer is that we had a population that comes out of the social order as a second-rate citizen, and that to a certain extent actually really did continue in the post-war / post-colonial period with the imposition of the the Mandarin so speak Mandarin only policy. So some mentalities, they don't change very easily, also with the generations that take time. And a final point, where the pluricentrism also reaches, also draws attention to the prestigious position, for sure, of Mandarin in society. But if we are going to change, argue for change of perception and open up to this idea, language and variance, it also requires that the Mandarin speakers open up to the idea of others sharing the benefits of their language dominance, and I'm finishing my presentation here with the promotion, the 2030 step that the government is taking towards English. This will complicate matters. Thank you very much.